When I first moved into the neighborhood, it seemed like a dream come true. The streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, mailboxes painted in identical shades, and houses that looked like they had been plucked straight out of a catalog. On the surface, it was the kind of neighborhood that many would envy, the kind where children played safely in the cul-de-sacs, neighbors waved politely, and life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. I was drawn to it for its order, its calm, and the promise of a place I could finally call home. I spent the first few months settling in, painting my front porch, planting flowers along the walkway, and getting acquainted with the neighborhood. Routines. I had little reason to question the homeowners association at first. Their rules seemed reasonable on the surface. Lawn heights, mailbox colors, exterior paint shades. These were details I could manage. Life felt simple, almost idyllic, and I felt the satisfaction of having found a sanctuary in the chaos of life. Then the letters started. It began with something subtle, almost bureaucratic. A notice slipped into my mailbox, marked with the official HOA letterhead. At first I barely noticed it, assuming it was some routine reminder about dues or community meetings. But as I unfolded the crisp white paper, my stomach sank. The words were carefully chosen, cold and absolute. The notice claimed that my backyard fence, a modest structure I had built for privacy and security, was not in compliance with community standards and demanded immediate corrective action. I was stunned. My fence was well maintained, neatly painted and fully within the bounds of my property. It wasn't visible from the street and it did not impede the neighborhood's appearance. Yet the HOA board, led by a woman everyone whispered about as Karen, seemed determined to make me feel small, powerless, and constantly on the defensive. The notice concluded with a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply could result in fines, legal action, and even potential eviction. At first I dismissed it. Surely this was an exaggeration, I thought. I carefully documented the fence, photographed every angle, and reviewed the HOA handbook. The rules clearly applied to visible front yard structures, and nothing in the fine print addressed backyard fences. My mind tried to rationalize it, telling myself that Karen and her board were probably just overzealous, that it would blow over once they realized their claim was baseless. But then more letters arrived, one after another, each more insistent than the last. They cited new violations almost daily. A small flower bed deemed unauthorized landscaping, a decorative lantern that supposedly disrupted community aesthetics, and a minor issue with the placement of my mailbox, which had been installed exactly according to code. The fines started small, mere tens of dollars, but the psychological weight they carried was massive. I felt the walls closing in, as if every decision I made on my own property was under constant surveillance and judgment. It wasn't just the letters. I began noticing their presence around my property. A sleek black SUV would linger at the end of the street, the driver watching silently as I trimmed my plants. Board members appeared unexpectedly at neighborhood events, always steering conversations toward subtle reminders of community responsibility and compliance. Once I spotted someone peeking over the fence while I was watering the garden, their posture stiff and almost predatory. It was a calculated, relentless effort to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. The turning point came with the first direct threat of eviction. Karen, with her polished aura of authority and meticulous demeanor, sent a letter that wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. According to the notice, the HOA had the right to pursue eviction proceedings for continued non-compliance with community standards, and my failure to obey their arbitrary rules would be interpreted as willful disregard of the covenant agreements. In that moment, the idyllic streets, the neat mailboxes, and the perfect lawns felt suffocating. The very people who promised community and safety now seemed determined to destroy what I had built, simply because I refused to bend to their arbitrary whims. I spent hours poring over the HOA rules, every page scanned for inconsistencies, loopholes, anything that could protect me. I consulted public records, cross-referenced bylaws, and quietly observed the board's actions. That was when I started noticing things others might have overlooked. Discrepancies in meeting minutes, payments that didn't add up, decisions made without quorum, and transactions that seemed personal rather than community-focused. There were hints of favoritism, subtle nepotism, and moments where rules were enforced selectively. Karen's power, it seemed, was not grounded in fairness but in intimidation. The realization was chilling. The letters, the fines, the threats, they weren't about property standards. They were about control. Karen and her board weren't enforcing rules because they cared about uniformity or aesthetics. They were enforcing power because they could. And like a predator circling a vulnerable prey, they expected fear to make me compliant. They expected submission. But instead of fear, I felt a spark of determination. The longer this continued, the more I understood that the key to survival wasn't bending, it was exposing the truth. I started quietly documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every trespass onto my peace of mind was meticulously recorded. Photographs, dates, times, and notes filled journals and digital folders alike. Security cameras discreetly installed around the property captured any intrusion, ensuring that nothing went unseen. It was a slow, careful accumulation of evidence, a quiet preparation for a battle that was far larger than a backyard fence. And then came the first real break in the board's carefully maintained facade. While reviewing financial reports and HOA budgets obtained through public records requests, I stumbled upon a string of suspicious transactions. A landscaping contract inflated beyond market rates, payments to companies owned by relatives of board members, and unaccounted funds siphoned from reserve accounts painted a picture of corruption far beyond petty garden disputes. What I had assumed to be isolated intimidation now looked like an elaborate system of control and enrichment, with Karen at its center. The pieces began to fall into place. The intimidation, the selective enforcement, the escalating fines, the threats of eviction. They were all a smokescreen to maintain her image of authority while protecting personal interests. And for the first time, I saw a path forward. This wasn't just about defending a fence anymore. This was about exposing the heart of the corruption that allowed one person to dominate an entire neighborhood under the guise of civility and rules. I knew I had to act carefully. One misstep, one rash confrontation, and Karen's board could escalate further, using every legal loophole and every shadow of influence at their disposal. But with patience, meticulous documentation, and the public records in my hands, I could turn the game around. The hunter had grown overconfident, blind to the fact that their prey was quietly becoming the one holding the ultimate advantage. As the sun set over the meticulously trimmed lawns, I stood in my backyard, the fence now, a symbol of defiance rather than privacy. Every flower, every plant, every corner of my property represented the life I had built and the resilience I refused to surrender. Karen had threatened eviction, intimidation, and harassment, but I had something more powerful: the truth. And, once revealed, it would change everything. This was only the beginning. After the initial shock of the eviction threat faded, I realized the situation was no longer simply about a fence or a backyard flower bed. Karen's obsession with control had revealed itself in subtle, insidious ways. The selective fines, the constant scrutiny, the letters with barely concealed menace. Every interaction, every official notice, every casually dropped comment from board members had been a test, one meant to gauge my reaction, to determine whether fear or compliance could be extracted from me. But now, standing in my backyard, I understood that fear was no longer an option. The path forward required patience, strategy, and careful observation. I began my investigation quietly, blending in with the normal rhythm of life in the neighborhood, while observing anomalies that had previously seemed innocuous. The first step was to study the board's history, its patterns, and its financial practices. Public records requests became a daily ritual. Minutes from past HOA meetings previously overlooked were pored over with meticulous attention. Every contract, every invoice, every budget allocation became a piece of the puzzle. I needed evidence, but not just any evidence, the kind that could expose intent, malice, and personal gain behind the veneer of community standards. It didn't take long to notice patterns that confirmed my growing suspicion. Landscaping contracts had been awarded repeatedly to the same company, a business owned by the cousin of one of the board members. Invoices were padded, labor charges inflated, and materials billed at double their market value. Neighborhood improvement funds, ostensibly used for maintenance and upgrades, had gone unaccounted for in some months and were redirected to entities with personal connections to the board. Each discovery chipped away at the carefully curated image of fairness and authority that Karen had cultivated. Even more revealing were the meeting minutes themselves. Karen had a way of orchestrating discussions to give the appearance of procedural fairness, while subtly guiding decisions to benefit herself and her inner circle. References to my property, veiled under phrases like unauthorized modifications or potential precedent-setting behavior, were highlighted in multiple entries. It became evident that my backyard, my fence, my flower bed, my very sense of ownership, was being used as an example, a cautionary tale to intimidate the rest of the neighborhood. The board's goal wasn't uniformity. It was submission. As I compiled this information, I began to notice the psychological patterns of Karen's approach. She relied on isolation, intimidation, and the slow buildup of pressure to wear down homeowners. Letters that seemed minor at first escalated over weeks, fines multiplied, and the implicit threat of eviction hung over me like a shadow. Yet there was also arrogance, a hubris born of long-standing control. Karen assumed compliance was inevitable. She did not anticipate resistance paired with knowledge. That overconfidence would soon prove to be her undoing. To protect myself and to document every action, I installed discrete surveillance cameras around the perimeter of my property. Motion-activated, high-definition, and linked to secure cloud storage, these devices captured every visit, every curious neighbor, and every potential trespasser. It was a precaution, yes, but also a strategic tool. If the board attempted to step beyond its authority, I would have the evidence. And if Karen continued her campaign of intimidation, the documentation would show the pattern, the premeditation, and the selective enforcement that characterized her control. Meanwhile, subtle alliances began to form. Neighbors who had long been silent started confiding in me, sharing stories of fines, letters, and threats they had quietly endured. Some were too fearful to speak openly, yet their whispered confirmations added credibility to the picture I was constructing. Karen had relied on the silence of the neighborhood, assuming that the threat of fines, legal action, and social ostracization would prevent anyone from challenging her. But even the quietest voices, once validated, became powerful allies in exposing the truth. The deeper I dug, the more audacious Karen's behavior appeared. It wasn't just financial misconduct or petty intimidation. It was a deliberate campaign of control, carefully disguised as governance. Every action against me, the constant surveillance, the letters, the threats of fines, was a rehearsed move in a game she thought she controlled. Yet her moves were predictable. Patterns emerged, motives became clear, and slowly, what had seemed like a terrifying landscape of power began to feel like a map, charted and understood. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I discovered the first truly explosive piece of evidence. A series of emails accidentally included in a batch of financial records released under public disclosure revealed explicit instructions from Karen to board members on targeting non-compliant homeowners. The emails outlined fines to be levied, letters to be drafted, and even suggested personal visits to homes of dissenters under the guise of community inspections. There was no ambiguity, no misinterpretation possible. This was direct, intentional harassment, orchestrated at the highest level. I realized at that moment that the fear she had used against me for weeks, perhaps months, could now be turned against her. The predator, the authority figure who had believed herself untouchable, had inadvertently exposed her own methods. The proof was now in my hands, carefully documented, verifiable, and irrefutable. Every threat, every fine, every intimidation tactic she had deployed could be cataloged and presented as evidence of a systematic abuse of power. The revelation brought a strange mixture of relief and resolve. Relief, because the terror of uncertainty that had weighed on me began to lift. Resolve, because I now understood that the next steps could shift the balance of power entirely. The board had assumed that threats, bureaucracy, and social pressure were enough to force compliance. They had miscalculated, believing that fear would outweigh evidence. They had underestimated the patience and meticulousness of someone who refused to back down. I began assembling the documentation into a coherent, chronological record. Letters, invoices, emails, photographs, surveillance footage, and witness statements were organized into a folder that was as complete as it could be. Each item was a piece of the puzzle, and together they painted a picture of an HOA gone rogue. A board driven not by rules or fairness, but by personal gain and a desire for control. Even as Karen continued her campaign, unaware of the full extent of what I had uncovered, I felt a quiet confidence. The balance had shifted subtly. No longer was I simply the target. I was now the observer, the archivist, the one holding the evidence that could dismantle the carefully constructed narrative of authority. Karen believed she had instilled fear, but she had done something far more significant. She had left a trail, and every misstep was recorded. And so, as another letter arrived in my mailbox, crisp, official, and threatening, I smiled quietly to myself. It was no longer a source of panic, but a marker of what had been uncovered, a reminder that every action taken against me was being carefully logged. Karen had threatened eviction, harassment, and fines, but she had inadvertently built the evidence that could end her reign. The first cracks in her armor were visible, and I knew that once they were fully exposed, there would be no turning back. The predator had assumed the role of the hunter, but the tide was shifting. The hunter would soon find herself in the crosshairs, and the one she sought to intimidate was quietly preparing the revelation that would bring her down. The deeper I delved into Karen and the board's operations, the clearer it became that this battle was no longer about minor infractions or backyard fences. What had started as intimidation and threats of eviction was part of a much larger pattern, one of financial manipulation, selective enforcement, and personal enrichment at the expense of the homeowners they were supposed to serve. By now I had a sense of the precise mechanisms they used to maintain control, but the most critical discovery, the secret that could upend the entire board, had yet to reveal itself. It began with an anomaly in the HOA's financial records. While reviewing the monthly statements and annual budgets obtained through public records requests, I noticed a series of unusually large transfers to an account labeled miscellaneous expenditures. At first glance, the label seemed innocuous, but the amounts were staggering, far beyond what a typical community fund would require for routine expenses. Every quarter, thousands of dollars disappeared into this account with minimal explanation. The vagueness alone was enough to raise suspicion, but what caught my eye was the pattern. Each transaction coincided with a new round of letters and fines targeting homeowners who had dared to challenge the board. Following the trail required patience. I spent days cross-referencing invoices, bank statements, and board meeting minutes. Each document taken alone appeared standard. Taken together, they painted a vivid picture of calculated mismanagement. Contractors were being paid double for basic landscaping, materials were purchased at inflated prices, and reimbursements were approved for services that were never rendered. It was clear that Karen, along with a few loyal board members, had created a system that allowed them to siphon money from the community under the guise of maintaining neighborhood standards. But the real shock came when I discovered the internal communications, the emails and memos that had been accidentally included in a public records request. These messages were meant to remain hidden, detailing personal instructions from Karen to the board on how to target specific homeowners. References to my own property were explicit, describing me as a problematic resident and outlining fines and enforcement actions intended to intimidate. There were discussions of surveillance, unauthorized visits, and even drafting false violation reports to justify escalating penalties. This was more than abuse of authority. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign of harassment, with financial gain as the hidden motive. The evidence revealed a network of deception. Contractors, neighbors, and even board members were complicit, either knowingly or through the assumption that they were following the rules. Payments were funneled through intermediaries to disguise the trail, but the digital footprints were still there. Each email, each forwarded invoice, each time-stamped message was another piece of the puzzle. Karen had believed that control, fear, and bureaucracy would shield her from scrutiny. She had underestimated the determination of someone who refused to comply and was willing to dig into the truth. It became evident that the eviction threat was never personal. It was a tool, a means to enforce submission and cover up the financial irregularities. By targeting me, Karen hoped to create a precedent, sending a clear message to any other homeowner who might challenge her authority. Dissent would be punished, and investigation discouraged. What she failed to realize was that I had been documenting everything from the start. Every letter, every surveillance observation, every irregularity in her financial dealings was logged, time-stamped, and securely stored. The hunter had made herself visible, and I was ready to expose her. I began organizing the evidence into a comprehensive dossier. Photographs of invoices, emails, and meeting minutes were compiled in chronological order, showing not only the misconduct, but the intent behind each action. The patterns were unmistakable. Intimidation was paired with financial gain. Harassment was strategic, and the secrecy of the operations was maintained by exploiting the bureaucracy that homeowners often ignored. The system Karen had relied upon for years was vulnerable, and every misstep she had made was now documented. As I worked, I considered the broader implications. This wasn't just my battle. It was the battle for every homeowner in the neighborhood who had ever felt powerless in the face of arbitrary fines, threats, or aggressive enforcement of rules. Karen had created an empire of fear, and the secret I had uncovered wasn't just a weapon for my defense. It was the key to liberating the community. The realization added a sense of urgency to my preparations. Timing would be critical. Revealing too much too soon could provoke retaliation, but waiting too long risked the board discovering that I had uncovered their hidden dealings. The process also required careful thinking about strategy. Public exposure could dismantle Karen's influence, but it needed to be done in a controlled manner, with evidence that was undeniable and easily digestible. I began considering the avenues for escalation: legal channels, neighborhood meetings, media exposure, but every option had to be meticulously prepared. The board had underestimated me, but I could not underestimate them. Their pride, arrogance, and reliance on intimidation made them unpredictable, and missteps could lead to new forms of harassment or legal maneuvering. It was during one late evening, as I reviewed the final batch of emails and scanned financial records, that the most damning piece of evidence emerged. Hidden among routine correspondence was a document revealing Karen's personal use of HOA funds. Expenses billed to community improvement were, in reality, luxury items for her private property and personal accounts. Vacation reimbursements, landscaping for her private yard, and even payments to family-owned businesses for services unrelated to the neighborhood were all listed. The financial deception was thorough and audacious, leaving little room for interpretation. This revelation changed the game. Karen's threats of eviction and intimidation were now a side note. The focus had shifted entirely. A personal betrayal of trust, financial misconduct, and abuse of authority. The evidence was irrefutable, and the ethical and legal implications were severe. This was not just about my backyard anymore. It was about accountability, transparency, and justice for the entire community. Karen had believed herself untouchable, but the dossier I had compiled was more than a collection of documents. It was a mirror reflecting the extent of her misconduct. For the first time, I felt a measure of empowerment. What had been fear was replaced with strategy, uncertainty with clarity, and vulnerability with control. Karen had relied on secrecy, intimidation, and bureaucratic complexity to maintain her reign. She had failed to anticipate a homeowner willing to document every move, analyze every pattern, and piece together the truth. The predator had made herself visible, and now it was time for the exposure phase. The next steps required careful orchestration. Every document, email, and record needed to be preserved in a way that could withstand scrutiny. Backup copies, Digital timestamps and secure storage ensured that nothing could be erased or challenged. I began drafting a plan to reveal Karen's secret, considering the sequence of exposure, the potential allies within the community, and the channels through which the information could be presented most effectively. The goal was not vengeance, it was accountability. Every homeowner deserves the chance to see the truth and act upon it. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across my backyard, I reflected on the irony of the situation. Karen had threatened me with eviction, assuming fear would force compliance. Instead, her arrogance had led her to expose a hidden pattern of abuse that could no longer be concealed. The hunter, confident and untouchable, had unknowingly left herself vulnerable. And I, the target of intimidation, was now in possession of the most powerful tool imaginable, the truth. By the time I reached the point of preparing my first exposure, the weight of the dossier I had compiled was tangible. Months of gathering evidence, scrutinizing every email, cross-checking invoices, and tracking suspicious financial transfers had culminated in a single, undeniable truth. Karen and her inner circle on the HOA board had been abusing their power for personal gain. But revelation required precision. Exposing such misconduct recklessly could backfire, and in this environment, retaliation was always a real threat. Yet, waiting too long could allow Karen to cover her tracks once she sensed a disturbance. Timing, strategy, and impact were everything. The first step was the neighborhood meeting, a platform Karen had always used to assert authority, often turning her speeches into personal attacks disguised as community updates. This meeting was normally a stage for theatrics, Karen flaunting her control, showcasing strict enforcement of rules, and subtly intimidating homeowners who dared question her decisions. It was a familiar performance, one designed to reinforce the hierarchy she had established. But now, for the first time, the narrative was about to change. The stage would become a courtroom of truth, and the predator would find herself vulnerable under the gaze of her community. Preparation for this public confrontation required meticulous planning. Every piece of evidence had to be clear, accessible, and indisputable. The invoices were paired with photographs of actual community work, or the lack thereof, showing payments for services that had never occurred. The email correspondence, carefully organized chronologically, painted a narrative that no amount of denial could dispute. Systematic targeting of specific homeowners, combined with financial exploitation of the community's resources. The secret, that Karen had so carefully hidden for years, was now presented in a way that even her staunchest supporters could not ignore. The day of the meeting arrived with an almost tangible tension. Karen's confidence was palpable. She assumed that her usual dominance over the proceedings would intimidate anyone attempting to challenge her. But as the meeting began and I took the opportunity to distribute the evidence, carefully redacted to protect privacy, but fully exposing the financial misconduct, the room's atmosphere shifted. The once rigid board members began exchanging uneasy glances, and Karen's expression tightened as she realized that the carefully orchestrated illusion of control was beginning to unravel. As neighbors flipped through the documents, murmurs spread across the room. The patterns were undeniable. Payments labeled as community improvement flowing to personal accounts, falsified invoices, and instructions for targeted harassment of residents, all meticulously documented. The evidence revealed a systematic exploitation of the very homeowners who had trusted the board to manage their neighborhood fairly. Karen's attempts to maintain composure failed as whispers turned to audible reactions. The first cracks in her authority had appeared, and they were impossible to conceal. The impact of the exposure was immediate and electrifying. Homeowners who had been intimidated into silence found a voice. Their expressions shifted from cautious fear to outrage, the same frustration I had felt during months of watching Karen manipulate the system. Many had suspected corruption, but concrete proof had always been elusive. Now it was tangible, organized, and undeniable. The aura of untouchability that Karen had cultivated over the years began to dissolve before our eyes, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and anger. For Karen, the first wave of panic was subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders. But anyone who had observed her demeanor closely could see it. The meticulously rehearsed speeches, the assertive posturing, and the carefully controlled tone faltered. Her hands trembled slightly, and her gaze darted across the room, searching for allies who were no longer steadfast. Board members who had once nodded in agreement during her monologues now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The game she had played for so long, built on fear and secrecy, was collapsing in real time. I continued to present the evidence with calm precision, allowing the documents to speak for themselves. The chronological sequence revealed not just financial impropriety, but a deliberate pattern of intimidation designed to maintain control over the community. Homeowners began recounting their own experiences of fines, surveillance, and harassment now validated by the evidence in front of them. The sense of unity and collective outrage grew, and the weight of Karen's actions became undeniable. This was no longer a personal dispute. It was a systemic issue that had impacted the entire neighborhood. As the meeting progressed, Karen attempted to regain control, her voice rising in an effort to dismiss the claims, to deflect attention, and to reassert her authority. But the strategy that had always worked, intimidation, selective enforcement, and bureaucratic complexity, failed spectacularly. The evidence was comprehensive, the timeline irrefutable, and the community now aware of the manipulation and deceit. Attempts to dismiss or undermine the documents were met with skepticism and rising voices from homeowners who had long been silenced. The first exposure had achieved something monumental. It transformed the perception of the board, and Karen in particular, from authority figures to accountable actors under scrutiny. The dynamic had shifted completely. Fear, which had been her primary tool, was replaced by awareness, empowerment, and collective resolve. The predator had become vulnerable, and the community, once passive observers, was now a fully engaged participant in demanding accountability. By the end of the meeting, Karen and her loyal board members were visibly shaken. The impact of the exposure reverberated beyond the confines of that room. Homeowners left with a sense of vindication, armed with knowledge and empowered to question every prior decision, every fine, and every rule enforced under pretenses. The first wave of public accountability had been delivered, but it was only the beginning. Karen's reaction in the days that followed would set the stage for the escalation to come. As I left the meeting, a quiet satisfaction settled in. Months of preparation, observation, and documentation had culminated in this moment. The first exposure had shifted the balance of power, and Karen, once untouchable, was now forced to confront the consequences of her actions. The dossier, the key evidence, and the community's collective awareness had transformed the predator into the hunted. The next chapter would not be gentle. Retaliation and desperation were inevitable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push both Karen and the homeowners to their limits. After the first exposure at the community meeting, the air in the neighborhood felt electric, charged with a combination of disbelief, vindication, and anticipation. Karen's carefully maintained facade of authority had been shattered, leaving her vulnerable and visibly shaken. But those who have wielded power through fear and manipulation rarely accept defeat quietly. In the days that followed, her tactics shifted from subtle intimidation to brazen attempts at retaliation, each move more desperate than the last. The quiet dread that had once settled over the community returned, now tinged with a sense of urgency and determination from homeowners who had seen the truth revealed. Karen's first attempts were bureaucratic. Notices of violations that had once been sporadic and targeted now arrived in rapid succession, sometimes multiple letters in a single day. Every minor deviation from community guidelines, no matter how insignificant, was cited in detail, accompanied by threats of fines and potential eviction. Where before she had relied on fear and reputation, she now leaned heavily on the threat of legal and financial consequences, hoping the sheer volume would wear down my resolve. But having spent months documenting every action, I was prepared. Each notice was cataloged, every fine contested, and every claim analyzed against HOA rules and local laws. The administration's weapons, which had always seemed formidable, became ineffective under scrutiny. Surveillance soon escalated. Karen, ever the strategist, had begun hiring private investigators, or so it appeared, who lingered in the neighborhood, ostensibly observing compliance. Cameras that had been innocuous during past neighborhood monitoring suddenly seemed more intrusive. Their presence was deliberate, designed to create a sense of constant surveillance and unease. Yet I approached this with methodical caution, recording every interaction, noting every suspicious vehicle, and compiling evidence that would later prove essential. What was intended as intimidation became documentation. Every step Karen took to instill fear turned into a piece of the story that would ultimately expose her further. In parallel, rumors began circulating. Karen attempted to manipulate neighbors, subtly spreading misinformation about my actions and motives. Whisper campaigns suggested that I had violated community norms intentionally, that I was causing unrest, and that supporting me could result in fines or retaliation. Yet the very community she tried to manipulate had already witnessed the incontrovertible evidence. Whispers of doubt turned into questions and eventually collective action. Some neighbors reached out privately, sharing similar experiences of intimidation and harassment, recounting letters, fines, and unjust citations that mirrored my own struggles. Karen's attempts to isolate me were failing spectacularly. Tensions escalated further as the community began to organize. Small meetings in living rooms, backyard discussions over coffee, and private exchanges through email chains began forming a network of homeowners unwilling to bow to arbitrary power. These gatherings, initially clandestine, gradually became more structured, a silent coalition growing in numbers and confidence. Karen's actions, meant to silence dissent, had inadvertently sparked a movement. Each retaliation, every threat, and every notice of violation served as fuel for collective outrage. The HOA's carefully constructed image of control was crumbling from the inside out. Meanwhile, my own strategy evolved. With legal counsel engaged, every act of intimidation was assessed for its legality. Every notice, every unauthorized surveillance attempt, and every interaction with Karen and the board was scrutinized for evidence of harassment or misuse of authority. The legal landscape, once a nebulous threat in Karen's favor, was now firmly in my control. Each retaliatory action she initiated was transformed into a piece of evidence demonstrating not only her personal vendetta, but also systemic abuse of power within the HOA. The hunter in this scenario was increasingly becoming the hunted. The lie. Board's desperation became more visible with each passing week. Karen's meetings, which had once exuded confidence and control, became erratic and defensive. Attempts to intimidate residents who had attended the exposure meeting often backfired, with homeowners openly questioning her and citing documented evidence of misconduct. Where fear had once reigned, skepticism and scrutiny began to dominate. The board's reliance on traditional authority was eroding, replaced by a growing recognition that the community no longer accepted blind obedience. The very tools that Karen had used for years, letters, fines, rules enforcement, were now ineffective against a population armed with knowledge and documentation. The tension reached a breaking point when an unauthorized attempt to enter my property occurred late one evening. Security cameras set up for precisely this reason captured the entire incident. Two board members carrying tools and seemingly intending to remove property or manipulate landscaping, crossing the fence line without permission. This act, clearly trespassing, became the most damning piece of evidence yet. What had begun as bureaucratic intimidation had now escalated into blatant criminal behavior, captured in high-resolution video and time-stamped for accuracy. Karen's veneer of legality and professionalism was irrevocably damaged. Word of this incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had previously remained on the sidelines were emboldened, some even offering assistance, resources, or statements of support. The narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer a personal dispute, but a matter of principle and legality. The community's outrage became a unified force, rallying around the evidence of harassment, trespassing, and systemic abuse. Each retaliatory act by Karen inadvertently strengthened the collective resolve of homeowners. What was meant to intimidate now empowers. By the end of the chapter, Karen's desperation was undeniable. Her once commanding presence had given way to visible strain, her authority undermined by concrete evidence, community awareness, and legal documentation. Every attempt to regain control was met with scrutiny, resistance, and exposure. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a culmination of months of harassment, retaliation, and strategic resistance that would ultimately decide the balance of power in the community. The narrative of fear, once dominated by Karen's iron fist, was now a story of accountability, empowerment, and the transformation of a lone homeowner into a symbol of justice. The culmination of months of tension, retaliation, and meticulous documentation had finally brought the story to a head. By now, the community was no longer a passive observer but an active participant in the unraveling of Karen's authority. Every action she had taken, each violation notice, every attempt at intimidation, each whispered rumor, had left a trail of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The balance of power had shifted decisively. The once feared HOA board, led by Karen, had become fragile, exposed, and vulnerable, teetering on the edge of accountability that they had spent years avoiding. What had started as subtle harassment had evolved into a full-blown investigation. With the support of a growing coalition of homeowners, documentation of fines, letters, trespassing incidents, and illegal surveillance was compiled into a comprehensive dossier. The HOA's own rules, meant to regulate minor issues in the community, were now being used against them, revealing inconsistencies, abuses, and secret dealings. This compilation didn't just expose Karen's personal vendetta, it illuminated systemic corruption within the board, including misappropriation of funds, undisclosed contracts, and conflicts of interest that violated both ethical standards and the law. The neighborhood, once quiet and obedient, now held undeniable proof that fear and intimidation were the HOA's true methods. The tension in the community escalated as residents realized the gravity of the revelations. Karen, sensing her precarious position, tried one last gambit, an emergency board meeting to assert authority, intimidate dissenters, and regain control. The agenda was thin, predictable, and transparently defensive, but it was clear she believed she could still leverage her position to maintain dominance. Instead, what she faced was a room filled with homeowners armed with evidence, questions, and the collective resolve of a united community. The energy was electric, a mixture of anticipation, defiance, and the quiet satisfaction of long-awaited justice. As the meeting unfolded, the impact of months of meticulous documentation became apparent. Each violation notice and every threat issued by the board was countered with evidence of procedural errors, legal violations, and inconsistencies. Each attempt to intimidate residents was exposed as a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate enforcement. Karen's demeanor shifted from confident authority to visible strain. The carefully maintained mask of power began to crumble in real time. The community, once compliant and wary, now held the upper hand. Their awareness, combined with the documentation, left Karen unable to defend herself or the board. Every act of aggression she had initiated came back as proof of misconduct. The turning point arrived when the issue of misappropriated funds was brought forward. Hidden contracts and unapproved expenditures, long shielded from residents, were revealed. Through financial audits and insider testimonies, Karen and the board had been diverting HOA funds into personal projects, inflating fees for projects that were never completed, and issuing fines that disproportionately benefited their own interests. This revelation shifted the narrative from a personal dispute to a matter of financial and legal accountability. The community recognized that their collective resources and trust had been exploited, and the outrage was palpable. The once feared board had now become the subject of scrutiny and accountability. In the days following the meeting, the legal implications began to manifest. Attorneys, engaged on behalf of the community, reviewed the evidence and prepared for formal complaints and potential litigation. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. Karen, who had relied on fear and intimidation for authority, now faced the reality of community-backed legal pressure. Every attempt to evict, fine, or intimidate was now documented as harassment and misuse of power, giving the community leverage that was previously unimaginable. The environment that had once enabled unilateral control was now dominated by transparency, oversight, and a united front of residents determined to uphold fairness. The final blow came not through confrontation, but through exposure. Local authorities, and legal bodies presented with irrefutable evidence of misconduct, began formal investigations into the HOA's practices. News spread through the neighborhood and beyond, and Karen's name became synonymous with abuse of power, nepotism, and intimidation tactics. Residents who had once feared speaking out found themselves emboldened, sharing their experiences and supporting one another. The narrative had shifted completely. What had begun as an individual fight against a single intimidating figure had grown into a community-wide awakening, exposing corruption and reclaiming control over shared spaces and governance. By the end of this ordeal, the balance of power was reversed. The board, and Karen in particular, had lost credibility, authority, and the ability to act unchecked. The community had not only protected a single homeowner from unjust eviction, but had established a precedent. No individual, regardless of title or position, could manipulate, intimidate, or abuse the collective trust of residents without consequence. Karen's secret, once tightly guarded, had been revealed, and the repercussions ensured that her influence would never again dominate the community. As the dust settled, the community began the slow process of restoration. Meetings were restructured for transparency. Oversight mechanisms were implemented, and residents who had been silent witnesses now held positions of active engagement. What had been a neighborhood overshadowed by fear was transformed into a model of accountability and civic participation. The story that began with threats, intimidation, and harassment ended with empowerment, justice, and a collective reclaiming of rights and property. The hunter had truly become the hunted, and the legacy of that reversal would serve as a cautionary tale for years to come. In the quiet aftermath, the home once threatened by eviction now stood as a symbol of resilience. The months of careful documentation, legal preparation, and unwavering determination had culminated in a victory not just for one homeowner, but for an entire community. Karen's downfall became a lasting lesson. Secrecy, fear, and corruption can never withstand the combined force of truth, accountability, and unity. The community, now stronger and more vigilant, had rewritten the narrative, ensuring that justice prevailed where intimidation once reigned.